The snow crunched under my boots as I glanced at the clock for the 100th time that morning. January days were cold and unforgiving, but this one felt warmer somehow, anticipation buzzing through me like a flickering ember in a fireplace. My son was finally coming home. 2 years in the army had turned the boy I raised into a man, and I couldn't wait to see him, hold him, and tell him how proud I was. I spent the morning fussing over dinner. His favorite dishes: braised beef stew, garlic mashed potatoes, and a chocolate cake dusted with powdered sugar, sat proudly on the dining table. I'd even dusted off an old red dress I hadn't worn in years, one that hugged me in all the right places. It wasn't fancy, but it made me feel elegant, like I'd put in the effort to welcome him back the way he deserved. When I heard the familiar sound of car tires crunching over ice outside, my heart skipped a beat. I rushed to the door, opening it just as my son stepped onto the porch. The sight of him stole my breath. He wasn't the lanky teenager I'd sent off 2 winters ago. His shoulders were broader, his face sharper, his stance brimming with confidence. He looked like a man who had faced the world and come out stronger. "Mom," he said, his voice deep and steady. Then he pulled me into his arms, and I melted into the embrace. He smelled of cold air and cologne, and as he held me, I realized how much I'd missed the feeling of his warmth. "You've gotten taller," I teased, pulling back to get a better look at him. "And you haven't aged a day," he replied with a grin, his gaze lingering a moment longer than necessary. My cheeks flushed under his stare, but I quickly turned toward the house. "Come on in. Dinner's ready," I said, bustling to give myself something to do. Inside, we sat at the table, the candlelight casting a soft glow on his face. He ate with an appetite I hadn't seen since he was a teenager, asking about home and telling me stories of his time away. I laughed and listened, savoring every second of his presence. As the evening wore on, he leaned back in his chair, his eyes on me. "I missed this," he said, his voice soft. "I missed you." "I missed you too," I whispered, feeling the weight of his words settle deep in my chest. "You're home now, and that's all that matters." His gaze didn't waver, and for the first time in a long while, I felt something stir inside me. A warmth, a sense of being truly seen. I pushed the feeling aside, reminding myself that he was my son, no matter how much he'd grown into himself. He reached across the table and took my hand, his grip firm but tender. "Mom, you've been my rock through everything. I don't know what I'd do without you." The sincerity in his voice brought tears to my eyes. "You'll never have to find out," I promised, squeezing his hand before letting go to clear the table. Later, as we sat by the fire, wrapped in blankets and sipping hot cocoa, he pulled me into another hug. This time he didn't let go so quickly. I felt the strength in his arms, the rhythm of his heartbeat against mine, and I couldn't help but think how much he'd changed. Or maybe it was me who was seeing him differently now. Either way, the connection between us felt deeper, richer, something I didn't yet have words for. That night, as I lay in bed, the house quiet once more, I replayed the day in my mind. My son had come home, but something had shifted between us, something I wasn't ready to confront. Not yet. I woke to the scent of coffee drifting through the house, mingling with the faint chill of the January morning. Pulling on my thick robe, I glanced out the window. Snow blanketed the yard, sparkling in the pale light of dawn. My breath caught as I spotted him outside. His broad shoulders wrapped in a wool coat, a small bio-fireplace flickering warmly by his side. I hurried downstairs and opened the back door to call out, "What on earth are you doing out there so early?" He turned, a wide smile lighting up his face. "Good morning, Mom," he said, his voice carrying easily through the crisp air. "I thought we could have breakfast out here." Just as I stepped outside, tugging my robe tighter around me. The cold bit at my cheeks, but the sight of him bustling around, arranging a small table and pulling out a pan, melted the chill. "You didn't have to do all this," I said, though my heart swelled at the gesture. He waved me off. "You've done so much for me, it's the least I can do. Now sit." He pulled out a chair, layered with thick blankets, and gestured for me to take it. I'll keep the fire going so you don't freeze. The bio fireplace crackled softly, its warm glow contrasting with the frosty landscape. I settled in, pulling the blankets around me as he began cooking. He cracked eggs into a small skillet, his movements practiced and confident. Every so often he glanced my way, his eyes soft and warm, as though he were memorizing every detail. "Where did you learn to cook like this?" I teased, trying to ease the strange electric energy building between us. "The army teaches you a lot," he replied, smiling. "But honestly, I just wanted to impress you." "You don't have to do anything special to impress me," I said, my voice soft. "I'm already so proud of you." His hand paused for a moment as he stirred the eggs, and when he turned back to me, his eyes were glassy, shimmering with unspoken emotion. "You've always believed in me, even when I wasn't sure I deserved it," he said, his voice tight. "I never thanked you for that. For everything." Tears pricked at my eyes, but I blinked them away, offering him a shaky smile. "You don't have to thank me. It's what mothers do." He knelt beside me, resting his hand on my arm. His gaze locked with mine, intense and searching. "You're more than a mother to me. You're everything. You've always been everything." The weight of his words settled heavily between us, and I felt my cheeks flush, not from the fire's warmth, but from the heat in his gaze. "You're everything to me too," I managed, my voice barely above a whisper. The moment stretched, the air between us charged with a tension I didn't dare acknowledge. He seemed on the verge of saying something more, but instead, he stood abruptly and returned to the pan, his movements quick and efficient as he plated the food. "Here," he said, setting a steaming plate of scrambled eggs and toast in front of me. "It's nothing fancy, but I hope it's good." I took a bite, savoring the rich, buttery flavor. "It's perfect," I said, meaning it in more ways than one. We ate in silence, the fire crackling softly as we stole glances at each other. Every time our eyes met, a jolt shot through me, leaving me warm and flustered. He was different now, not just in how he looked but in how he carried himself, how he looked at me. As I finished the last bite, he reached out and brushed a crumb from the corner of my mouth. His fingers lingered for just a moment too long, sending a shiver down my spine. "You're beautiful," he said suddenly, his voice low and earnest. "I don't think I've ever told you that." My breath caught, and I looked away, my heart racing. "Stop," I murmured, trying to deflect the compliment. "I'm serious," he insisted, his hand still hovering near my face. "You've always been beautiful, but now I see it more clearly. I guess I see you differently." I didn't know how to respond. His words ignited something in me, something I didn't know how to name. I laughed nervously, trying to lighten the moment. "I must look a mess in this old robe." "You've never looked more perfect," he said, his voice steady. The way he looked at me, like I was the only thing in the world, left me breathless. I stood abruptly, brushing the blanket aside. "We should go inside before we freeze out here," I said, my voice higher than usual. He nodded, standing as well. "Of course," he said, but his eyes lingered on me, and I felt his gaze like a warm touch. As we gathered the dishes and extinguished the fire, I couldn't shake the feeling that something irreversible had shifted between us. Inside, the house felt too quiet, too small. I busied myself in the kitchen, avoiding his eyes. But every time he moved closer, every accidental brush of his hand against mine sent my heart racing. That morning, something unspoken passed between us, something neither of us dared to name. And though I told myself it was nothing, a part of me couldn't help but wonder where this path might lead. The idea of heating the bathhouse in the middle of winter was, admittedly, indulgent. But when my son suggested it that evening, his voice warm and inviting, I couldn't say no. The thought of it sparked something inside me, a mix of nervous anticipation and the quiet thrill that had been humming between us all day. "I'll get it ready," he said, his eyes locking onto mine with a hint of mischief. "You just bring yourself and that gorgeous smile of yours." His words lingered in the air as he stepped outside to prepare the bathhouse. I stood there for a moment, wrapping my arms around myself to steady the fluttering in my chest. His compliments came so effortlessly now, and each one left me feeling lightheaded, like a teenager being noticed for the first time. By the time I joined him, the bathhouse was warm, the rich aroma of cedar mingling with the gentle steam. He had set out fluffy towels, and a lantern cast a soft golden glow over the room. It was intimate in a way that made my breath hitch. "Perfect timing," he said, flashing me that smile of his. "The water's just right." As I slipped into the warm water, the tension in my body eased, but the tension between us only grew. He joined me, settling across from me in the small, steaming pool. The flickering lantern light played across his face, accentuating the strong lines of his jaw and the quiet intensity in his eyes. For a while we just talked, our voices low and close. He told me more stories from his time in the army, moments that shaped him into the man he'd become. And I listened, captivated not just by his words but by the way he looked at me, as though I were the only person in the world. "You know," he said after a pause, his voice dipping lower, "I don't think I ever realized how much I missed you until I came home." I smiled, though my heart raced at the way he said it, so raw and unguarded. "I missed you too," I said softly, my fingers trailing through the water. He moved closer then, his gaze holding mine with an intensity that made my pulse quicken. "You're incredible, Mom," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "You've always been so strong, so beautiful." The words sent a flush up my neck, and I looked away, trying to calm the sudden heat blooming inside me. "You're just trying to butter me up," I teased, though my voice trembled slightly. "I'm serious," he said, his hand brushing lightly against mine under the water. The contact sent a spark through me, and I felt my breath catch. "You're everything to me." His words hung in the air, heavy with emotion. For a moment I didn't know what to say. I felt overwhelmed by the connection between us, the spark that had grown into a quiet flame. After we finished in the bath, we wrapped ourselves in towels and walked back to the house, the cold air biting at our skin. Inside, he led me to the sofa, where a bottle of wine waited, 2 glasses already poured. He handed me one, his fingers brushing mine as he did. I couldn't tell if it was the wine or his touch that sent a rush of warmth through me. "Sit," he said, gesturing to the couch. "I have something in mind." He turned on the TV, scrolling through the options until he settled on an old romantic film. The soft glow of the screen filled the room as we sat side by side, the wine loosening our words. His arm rested along the back of the sofa, his warmth radiating toward me. When a scene came on where the male lead invited the woman to dance in the flickering glow of a fire, my son shifted beside me. "Dance with me," he said suddenly, his voice low and filled with something I couldn't name. I laughed softly, glancing at him. "You're serious?" "Absolutely," he said, standing and holding out his hand. "Come on, Mom. Just one dance." There was something in his eyes, something tender yet unyielding, that made it impossible to refuse. I placed my hand in his, letting him pull me to my feet. The music from the movie spilled into the room as he wrapped one arm around my waist and took my hand in his. We swayed together, his movements steady and sure. My heart thudded wildly in my chest as he guided me across the small space. His hand on my back was warm, firm yet gentle, and his eyes never left mine. "You're a good dancer," I said, my voice softer than I intended. He smiled, his thumb brushing against my hand. "I have a good partner." The words sent a shiver through me, and I felt heat rise to my cheeks. I wanted to say something to lighten the moment, but then he leaned in and pressed a soft kiss to my cheek. His lips lingered there, warm against my skin, and I felt my breath hitch. "Thank you," he whispered, his voice rough with emotion. "For everything." When he pulled back, his eyes searched mine, and for a moment time seemed to stop. The world outside faded, leaving only the two of us, wrapped in the quiet intimacy of the moment. We sat back down on the sofa, closer this time. His arm draped over my shoulder. The movie played on, but neither of us paid it much attention. The spark between us had grown into something undeniable, something I couldn't ignore. As the evening deepened, I found myself leaning into him. His warmth and presence a comfort I hadn't realized I craved. And as his fingers brushed gently against my arm, I knew that something had changed between us, something that would forever alter the way we saw each other. That night, as the movie droned on in the background, the warmth of my son's touch lulled me into a peaceful haze. His fingers traced light, soothing patterns along my back, and I felt my body sink deeper into the sofa. The weight of the day, the bathhouse, the wine, it all caught up with me. Before I knew it, I'd shifted, resting my head on his legs. His warmth and presence an anchor as my eyes fluttered shut. His hand never stopped its slow, tender movements, and though I was on the edge of sleep, I could feel his gaze on me, intense and thoughtful. I felt safe, cherished even, in a way I hadn't felt in years. The world beyond that moment seemed far away, and as I drifted off, I felt the faintest brush of his lips against my temple, a gesture so soft I could have dreamed it. When I woke the next morning, I was in my bed. The sunlight filtered softly through the curtains, and the house was quiet, save for the creak of the floor as I swung my feet down. He must have carried me upstairs when I fell asleep, I realized, my heart swelling at the thought. The memory of his strong arms, the comfort of his embrace, lingered in my mind as I headed downstairs to start breakfast. The kitchen was still and empty. I made coffee, scrambled eggs, and toast, setting the table for two. But as the minutes ticked by, he didn't appear. I glanced toward the window, expecting to see him outside, but the yard was empty. A quiet unease began to stir within me. Where was he? Finally, I decided to go upstairs and check on him. His door was slightly ajar, and I knocked softly before stepping inside. He was lying on his bed, one arm draped over his forehead, his gaze fixed on the ceiling. The moment I saw him, I knew something was wrong. "Are you okay?" I asked, my voice gentle as I stepped closer. His eyes flicked to mine briefly before returning to the ceiling. He hesitated, his chest rising and falling with a deep breath. "No," he admitted finally, his voice low and strained. "I'm not." I sat on the edge of the bed, my heart pounding. "What's wrong?" I pressed, reaching out to touch his arm. He flinched as if my touch startled him, but then he sighed and sat up, his elbows resting on his knees. He ran a hand through his hair, and when he looked at me, his eyes were full of emotion, raw, unguarded, and impossible to misinterpret. "I don't know how to say this," he began, his voice shaky. "I've been trying to hold it in, trying to push it away, but I can't anymore." "Push what away?" I asked, though a part of me already knew. He let out a humorless laugh, shaking his head. "My feelings for you, Mom. They're not what they're supposed to be." The air seemed to leave the room, and I froze, my breath catching in my throat. He continued, his voice thick with emotion. "I love you," he said, the words falling heavily between us. "Not just as my mom, but more. So much more." Tears welled in his eyes, and he looked away, as though ashamed. "I've felt this way for a while now, but being home, spending this time with you, it's only gotten stronger. I know it's wrong, but I can't pretend anymore. I want to be with you." My heart broke and swelled all at once. The honesty in his voice, the vulnerability etched into every word. It was overwhelming. Tears blurred my vision as I reached for him, my hand trembling. "I don't know what to say." "You don't have to say anything," he said quickly, his voice trembling. "I just needed you to know. I couldn't keep it inside anymore." A tear slipped down my cheek, and I wiped it away, but more followed. "I feel it too," I admitted, my voice barely a whisper. "I felt something changing between us. I've been trying to ignore it, but I can't." His eyes widened, and for a moment we just stared at each other, the weight of our shared confession hanging in the air. Then slowly he reached for my hand, his fingers warm and steady as they closed around mine. "I know this isn't easy," he said softly, "and I don't want to make things harder for you. But I need you to know how much you mean to me. You're everything, Mom. Everything. I couldn't hold back the sob that escaped my lips. The love in his voice, the depth of his feelings. It was impossible to deny. I moved closer, wrapping my arms around him as the tears spilled freely. He held me tightly, his face buried in my shoulder. I love you too, I whispered, the words trembling on my lips. I don't know what this means or where it will lead, but I can't pretend anymore either. We sat there for what felt like an eternity, holding each other as the world outside faded into irrelevance. In his arms I felt safe, cherished, and completely seen. Whatever lay ahead, I knew one thing for certain. Our lives had forever changed.